Good afternoon. Welcome to the press conference on the EU and Vietnam Free Trade Agreement and Investment Protection Agreement that the Parliament has adopted this noon with quite a comfortable majority. Next to me here you will find Mr. Geert Bourgeois, who is the rapporteur for the subject, and the chairman of the International Trade Committee, Mr. Bernd LANGE. First, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Geert Bourgeois.
Okay, thank you very much. A warm welcome on behalf of myself and, of course, on behalf of the chair. We had a very good cooperation. I'm the new rapporteur for the Free Trade Agreement and the Investment Protection Agreement, but I'm very enthusiastic and I'm very glad that there is a great majority to approve both the agreements. It's first of all about trade and investment, and it's the most comprehensive trade agreement ever with a middle-income country. The aim is, of course, removing barriers, and for 99% of the products, the tariffs will be reduced to 0%, which will give a boost to the export in both directions. The export from Vietnam to the EU is expected to grow by 2035 with 15 billion a year. And in the other direction, the export from the EU to Vietnam will grow with more than 8 billion a year. And this will create many thousands of new jobs and, on average, well-paid jobs. The European Union, there is a calculation that for every billion of added export, there is 14,000 new jobs. So this will create a lot of jobs in the European Union. Also in Vietnam, it will create prosperity. It also shapes, then I'm talking about the Protection Investment Agreement. It's shaping a predictable framework for companies that want to invest with an ICS, a very modern international court system. By the way, Vietnam was the first to adopt this system. It's implemented in the CETA agreement, but Vietnam already earlier agreed with this ICS system, which is a very good system with independent judges, with a code of conduct, with a facilitated access for SMEs and so on. Third, there is access to public procurement, which also gives opportunities for our companies to participate in public works in Vietnam. Second item I want to stress is the geopolitical and even maybe geostrategical importance of these two trades, because in these times of, let's say, more instability, trade conflicts, tensions in trade, the WTO, which is not operational today, I think it's of the utmost importance that the EU plays its role as a global player. It's the ambition of the Commission von der Leyen to be a global player. I think it's a very good signal from the European Parliament to agree, and it's the first agreements for the new elected Parliament, first trade agreements that this new elected Parliament had to deal with. So I think we should give a signal that we are in favor of trade based on rules. This is very, very important. In the meantime, it's not only an agreement with Vietnam, but Vietnam is at this moment the chair of the Asian region countries, 10 countries, and it's the gateway to the Asian countries, and we hope that finally there could be an agreement, region to region, European Union to the Asian, South Asian countries, which are growing very fast. And it's very interesting also to have with them agreements. This is, of course, not for the coming months or coming year. Last point I want to stress is that the trade agreements of the European Union are a lever for labour rights, for climate change and for human rights. It's first of all about trade. I want to stress it. It's not a climate agreement. There are other international multilateral agreements, but our partners have to subscribe the United Nations Framework Agreement from 1992, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement. They also have to implement the fundamental ILO conventions, which is now going on in Vietnam. Vietnam is ratifying and has ratified already conventions. They have to do 2 additional, if I'm well informed, and to implement it in their labor code, which is also done. And this means that in Vietnam, they are obliged to give freedom of association for the unions, collective negotiations on labor, eliminate forced labor, and also compulsory labor. So it gives really also an impulse to better labor conditions, better labor standards in our partner country. Finally, in the strategic partnership agreement, above the agreements, is mentioned that is the issue of the human rights mentioned, which is very important for the European Union. And so our partner has to engage to respect human rights, also accept non-proliferation weapon of mass destruction, and to subscribe the Millennium Development Goals. And you know there are sanctions on it when we don't see an improvement on human rights, when we see that there's, on the contrary, a way back, then the Union does not hesitate to take measures. We have the examples already with Cambodia, with Myanmar too. And so it's about trade, it's about investment, it's about access to public procurement, but it's also a lever to create and to give a boost to our values worldwide. We had a very good partner. Thanks to the chair, in the last weeks we could become more concessions of Vietnam about concerns of the European Parliament. There will be, for the first time, a joint committee to monitor and to follow up these agreements, a joint committee between the European Parliament and the Vietnamese National Assembly. There will be also access to the subcommittee droit from this House to the human rights dialogue with Vietnam, so that we can closely follow up the progress concerning the human rights. And finally, Vietnam agreed that there will be independent organizations in what we call the domestic advisory groups. These are the groups that are following up the implementation of the agreements. And we stress that there should be an opening for independent organizations. So this is about the content and overview. And Bernd, I'm sure you will add some more interesting items.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Bourgeois, our rapporteur. I would just mention that a lot of the achievement were achieved by the European Parliament, and I'm really proud of the European Parliament using the leverage we have to improve the agreement with Vietnam. Since 2009, the European Parliament is able to use the power they have because of the Lisbon Treaty to negotiate with third countries on different items. And we need this leverage, this power, to really make trade agreements workable. Because it's totally clear that today the people are more sensitive about trade policy than perhaps 20 years ago. It's not just about tariffs. Of course, tariffs are not so sexy. But it's about consumer protection, about standards, about pesticides in products, and it's about labor rights, and it's about environmental standards. And nowadays, I think it's not acceptable to have a trade agreement on the table where these elements are not tackled in a proper way. And therefore, the Parliament started, as Parliament, negotiations with the Vietnamese government, with the ILO, and with the Commission to get some further improvements for the relation. And as our rapporteur mentioned, there are a lot. The ratification of 3 missing ILO conventions with a binding implementation plan, a clear commitment for having civil society in the domestic advisor groups for monitoring the implementation, the question of discuss the human rights issues, and a lot of further items which were agreed by Parliament, Vietnamese government, and also with ILO Commission. And that's, of course, also important that we have some forces which are working on the implementation process, on capacity building, and this can be guaranteed as well. And therefore, I'm really happy that this time the Parliament is really going ahead and makes such a progress compared to previous agreements, specifically with a country like Vietnam. And it's no secret that we have a lot of differences in a lot of areas. But I'm deeply convinced that even we have a lot of different views, the only possibility to get the situation for the people on the ground better is dialogue. And therefore, we are standing ready for a constructive dialogue with the Vietnamese government, with the Vietnamese people on several items. And therefore, I'm also happy, as Mr. Bourgeois mentioned, that for the first time we agreed with the Parliament of a partner region, here with the National Assembly of Vietnam, to establish some kind of joint committee between National Assembly and the European Parliament to scrutinize the process and stick to the dialogue. That's really a big success for the European Parliament.
Thank you very much. And let's stick to the dialogue. So if there are any questions from the floor, please state your media and your name. Yes, please.
Louis Larvé pour Radio Nord-Bretagne.
Despite these achievements, the achievements of your committee, aren't you a little bit concerned with regard to the implementation of human rights, respect for the labour conventions and so on? I mean, how are you going to check that all these conditions are actually fulfilled on the ground? Not in the first 3 months, obviously, but in the forthcoming years. How are you going to check that?
On est très concernés là-dessus, c'est pourquoi
we are very concerned about that, which is why we asked for so many concessions from the Vietnamese side. We wanted overall monitoring together with bringing together the European Parliament and the National Assembly. We also demanded that civil society and independent organisations should be involved in domestic advisory groups in order to monitor developments. It is my belief that the Commission will be able to provide technical assistance to Vietnam. The Commission has that role of providing assistance, but also checking, monitoring events. And I think there are enough instruments available for monitoring. In relation to Cambodia and Myanmar, for instance, the Commission has not had any qualms about imposing a temporary suspension on preferential tariffs for those countries and then going back to the WTO. So it's not far-fetched, it is actually realistic. the question was, should we wait before we have the agreements, or should we approve the agreement and then monitor? And the ILO's view was that it was better to ensure that there was monitoring afterwards, that you start trying to get the conventions through and then you go down the monitoring path. I think if we hadn't taken that approach, we wouldn't have been able to achieve what we have achieved. So we get ratification of ILO conventions, a change in the labour code, an agreement on monitoring between the parliaments of the two sides, and monitoring of the situation for prisoners too. So the question really is a chicken and egg one. Do you ask for everything up front from the European side? And the answer is no. We're talking about a developing country that has made significant progress since the Second World War, has had 3 wars itself since the Second World War, has achieved a lot of progress, economic growth, and it is our belief, with our chair, who referred to Willy Brandt's policy of rapprochement to such countries, because the alternative is isolation, no contact. No, we want contact, exchanges, personal contact, young people, traders, businesses. And that's a lever, as I said earlier, to improve the situation. If you say we should ask for just as much as we ask of countries that already have a democracy in place and civil society and so on, then I don't think that's a realistic expectation, because they're not starting from the same starting point. It's a process, and this is what the EU can bring to that process. Set standards for products, for the environment and so on around the world, and stand up for individual freedom. I very much believe in that way of doing things. So yes, there are concerns in the Commission, in plenary. We too have our concerns. We're not whitewashing it, saying there's no problem. But in the negotiations, the chair and myself and have been very clear. We've met with the Vietnamese delegation on several occasions and said this has to change, that has to change.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, anything to add?
Just saying, similar to the last phrase in this famous movie, Casablanca, where the general said to his guest, this is the beginning of a wonderful friendship. The work is now starting. So we are not ready. We are just starting for the implementation, for the dialogue, for future relationships. And this is, of course, based on trust, so that we can, like Willy Brandt said, getting closer and bring change.
Thank you. Any more questions? Well, if not, then thank you for your participation and thank you for the information.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.